So yeah, when BERT plays the lottery, all tickets are winning. This is a joint work with Cypress Anna and Anna Romshinsky, and this is mostly work presented in a recent AMNLP paper, but I'm going to also briefly cover some takeaways from BERTology from last year, which led to this work. So since you're all here, I am going to assume that you all know everything about BERT. And if not, now is the time to say so. Okay. So you may have seen this survey that we tried to publish like last February. It was called the Primary in BERTology, and we started with 40 studies. That was February 2020. By the time we submitted it to tackle, there was 100 papers. By the time we submitted camera ready, there was 150. And it covers things until about mid-July, at which point we gave up. So BERT, the study of the analysis of BERT, the extensions of BERT, it became such a huge topic that it's just, yeah, we gave up. I don't think it's possible to keep up with it anymore. Still, at the point at which we were writing this paper, these are the major takeaways that we were basing this research on. First, there is some linguistic knowledge and it can be extracted from the pre-trained weights. In particular, this paper got a lot of traction. It showed that you can take BERT representations and find such a linear transformation for them that would roughly correspond to syntactic trees. And yeah, I think they ended up making it to some Nature subjournal. Another direction was that you can train different classifiers, and they will show that BERT has knowledge of parts of speech tags, of chunks, and other such things. Another thing was the study of self-attention heads. You probably know that there's a big debate on whether attention is interpretable, and there's attention is explanation, and attention is not explanation, and attention is not explanation. But I guess the majority of the BERTology work proceeds on the assumption that self-attention is an explanation, because you see diagrams like this, and you see the studies that will try to find the self-attention heads that will correspond to different syntactic relations, like in this head, like in this table. So at least an underlying assumption in a lot of this work is that self-attention is interpretable, and it must be at least one of the mechanisms by which BERT is able to achieve its performance. This is another such study which explicitly tried to correlate attention heads with syntactic dependencies from Sam Bauman's team. One more direction was trying to look at different BERT layers and see what kinds of information are included in the layers. In this paper by Tenney, they looked at the evolution of representations, and they looked specifically at whether it is the case that predictions change if you take different layers instead of the final layers, the output, and sometimes they do. These examples show that sometimes the earlier layers make mistakes, and then BERT self-corrects by the final layer. Another direction was to just see whether all layers are equally meaningful, and this, by now, I think consensus, maybe the only point on which all the studies agree, that the middle layers seem to be the most transferable and the most informative. Whereas the final layers are the most task-specific and and contain the least amount of just general linguistic information. And another big takeaway from BERTology literature, and well, not just BERTology literature, but I guess BERT was just used as a test case in these studies, was that in many tasks and data sets, we are not doing what we think we are doing, because we are actually not learning the underlying linguistic phenomenon. We're just learning different biases and artifacts in the data sets. And we really have no reason to expect for that not to happen, because if the data provides a strong statistical signal that, for example, the word never is a strong predictor of the negation of the contradiction label in NLI, then you can't be angry with your model for learning that. So these are the studies that showed that this was the case specifically for BERT in NLI, in reading comprehension, and probably everything else as well. And one more, and this is more on the machine learning side. One more takeaway was that BERT is not stable across fine-tuning initializations. And even the original paper mentioned that some fine-tuning runs will just not converge, they will be degenerate. But this paper, which came out in the Black Box NLP workshop last week, it showed that not only is there variation in performance, there is a huge variation in generalization performance. So in some cases, your fine-tuning initialization will look the same as some other fine-tuning initialization on the test set, but they will be very different on an unseen adversarial test set. In this case, it was MNLI and Hans. So some fine-tuning runs will generalize to Hans much better than others, and you have no way of telling that unless you actually check. And that, I think, has big and depressing implications for actual deployment of deep learning models in production, because, well, it means that some fine-tuning initializations will perform better for the end users and some will not, and we just have no way of telling it. And this is pretty much, and even if it did, it would be down to us fine-tuning the random seed pretty much. So that's depressing. And one more takeaway from the BERTology from last year is that it is clearly heavily overparameterized. You can prune many heads, you can prune even entire layers, and mostly you will not lose performance. Sometimes you will even slightly gain performance. So all of these papers, they point at that. So while all of that was happening in the computer vision community, people were working on the lottery ticket hypothesis. And as originally formulated, it discussed dense and randomly initialized feed-forward networks. And the main claim was that there are such subnetworks, the winning tickets, that can be trained in its isolation and still reach the test set comparable to the original network in a similar number of iterations. So this was initially formulated for feed-forward networks. There is now work testing it for CNNs, for transformers. I guess I should mention that while we were presenting this paper in EMNLP, we found a poster in the same session, similarly testing not BERT but Bayes transformer, also with regard to lottery ticket hypothesis, and coming to similar conclusion. So I guess whatever I'm going to show you is relatively validated. So our main thing here was to see whether we can do the same and test the same lottery ticket hypothesis with respect to pre-trained weights. So usually lottery ticket hypothesis is explored with respect to randomly initialized networks, but in this case we have BERT and it's pre-trained, and our research question was whether or not it would still behave the same. And I think we can say that we are the first people to put a preprint on archive on this matter. Our 4 questions were: does lottery ticket hypothesis still hold for pre-trained weights? And are the pruned subnetworks stable across the random seeds and tasks? Also, we wanted to know how good the good subnetworks are and also how bad the bad subnetworks are. And this is something that has not been looked at before. And finally, do the pruned subnetworks help to explain how BERT works for different tasks? Once again, if I have just shown you all this huge pile of BERTology literature that was looking at how BERT has interpretable heads, how BERT has all this information. If it is the case that BERT can be pruned, if it is the case that we can find those winning tickets, and if it is the case that the winning tickets help us to explain how it actually works, well, then we can understand much better what is going on. So our setup was pretty standard. We just took all 9 glue tasks, and every experiment that you are going to see was repeated with 5 random seeds. The same seeds across all experiments. We tried 2 pruning methods. The first is the magnitude pruning, which is standard in lottery ticket hypothesis work. So you just decide which weights to prune based on their magnitude. You pick the smallest ones, and at each iteration we prune the 10% of the whole model for as long as our performance is still at least 90% of the full model performance.
I have a question.
Yep.
Have you trained like the full model together with a head for a specific task, or you fine-tuned only model and have fixed random head for a specific task?
The full thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is what we do for the magnitude pruning, and then we also try structured pruning, and this is usually not done in lottery ticket hypothesis work, but here again, the idea was that BERT has these interpretable heads, so why not try to prune them separately? So we for this, we need to select which heads to prune, and we do this based on the importance scores that Michel and colleagues proposed last year. And yeah, we pick the least important heads and 1 least important MLP at each iteration, and we prune them again for as long as we have at least 90% of the full model. And they didn't do the MLPs. We added the MLP component, but we hypothesized that it should work the same. So these are the 2 methods. And this is what it looks like if you try to do both of them. So this is for QNLI. And on the right, you see the good subnetwork that you will get from the structured pruning. The darker cells are the heads and MLPs that survive in all 5 random inits. So yeah, the 12 by 12 diagram, that's 12 heads. The lower diagram, that's the 12 layers. From 0 to 11, and so if you see zeros, it means that this head or MLP just never survived. There are 2 numbers in each cell. The top one means how many times on average it survived out of 5 runs, and the second one is the standard deviation. And on the left, you see magnitude pruning. So here it's simpler because we just prune the weights through the entire model, and what you see, the top number is the percentage of surviving weights, and the second number is the standard deviation. So this is pretty much obvious that the 2 maps don't look the same, and perhaps we shouldn't have expected that they would, but at least from looking at this, we can definitely say that it is not the case that some heads are useless because they only have small weights. Right?
And on the bottom, what is this? It's the total pruning for the layer?
No, not the layer, the MLP in the layer.
Mm-hmm. Because actually, as your heads are independent, mm-hmm. then it seems that you can like change the columns of these graphs as you wish and still obtain the same result. I mean, if you want to compare these 2 diagrams, you need to find order of the columns which gives you most like a similar picture or some measure by layer how much pruning was for a given specific layer. You will have it later, yes? Or have you done
I don't think I understand the question. So these are the same heads and layers.
So if you have layers as rows in this figure, yes? And heads are as a columns.
Yep. Yeah, layers are columns, yes, and heads. Oh, wait. It says so on the axis, right? So the vertically we have layers, yes, and horizontally we have heads.
So, for example, fifth layer is all the heads forms one row, or not? Because it's layer 5, and we have layer.
So you see 12 heads for layer 5 in both diagrams.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so anyway, this is trivial, but just to make sure, yes, it is not the case that some heads only have small weights. Our first question is how stable are those good subnetworks across the random initializations? And for magnitude pruning, you see that standard deviation is 0 most of the time. So for magnitude pruning, the good subnetworks are very, very stable for different tasks, for different fine-tuning initializations. The subnetwork will be mostly the same. For structured pruning, it is not the case. You see that like 70% of heads have standard deviation 45 to 55, which means that they mostly, yeah, it's like a coin toss whether they survive or not. And there are relatively few heads that always survive or never survive. The Fly's kappa for the survival masks is also low. And the reason it happens is that the distribution of important scores looks like this. So most important scores are actually low, which means that most heads are about equally unimportant. So you can prune any one of them with about making about equal difference to the model. So what about the stability across tasks? Our rationale for doing this, for looking across random initializations, was that if it is the case that BERT does indeed encode some specific linguistic knowledge, then presumably we would want it to use the same strategy across different fine-tuning initializations, right? Because then you would know that you would be getting the same thing. So that is already not the case. We already see that it does not employ the same reasoning, if reasoning is the right word, across different fine-tuning initializations. What about across tasks? We should be able to see that the good subnetworks are at least more similar for more closely related tasks, if it is the case that BERT does similar things when it solves these similar tasks. That is still the case for magnitude pruning. The diagrams look almost identical. And actually, the authors of the original lottery ticket hypothesis, they also published a study in parallel with ours. And they also only looked at magnitude pruning, but they looked specifically at whether the different subnetworks could be transferred between tasks. And here you see in this table, the minus 0.7, for example, means that if you take the subnetwork found for one task and you just apply it to a different task, this is how much performance you will lose. So you see that for many glue tasks, the loss in performance is not big, which means that, yes, those subnetworks are more or less the same, and that's consistent with what we see. By the way, note that one task in which the transfer works very well is WNLI. So in most glue tasks, you see that the performance mostly improves on transfer. And keep that in mind, because we'll see why in a few slides. So what about structured pruning? again, if it is the case that BERT does something meaningful, then we would want it to do the same thing across tasks. That is not happening. So here you see Microsoft paraphrase corpus and Quora question pair task, and they both rely on paraphrase knowledge, and you see that the subnetworks are not similar at all, even though the tasks are supposed to be related. This is how many heads are shared on average if you go if you compare the overlaps between the good subnetworks between different tasks. And you see that both COLA and MNLI, M and MRPC and QNLI, they all share about 50 to 55 heads, even though they're all very different. So that does not seem to be the case, but let us go back to WNLI. You know that this is the most difficult glue task. And our experiments actually explain why BERT can't do it. So for any other task, I'm showing STSB here on the left as an example. For any other task, even if it is unstable across initializations and tasks, BERT can find some subnetwork. There is always some heads that are clearly useful for it to solve this task and this fine-tuning initialization. For WNLI, the good subnetwork looks like this. It is empty because all heads and non-MLPs are just equally useless. They have equal chance of getting pruned away. So it seems that for BERT to learn anything at all, it has to be able to find some good subnetwork, and it just can't do it at all for WNLI, which also explains why the lottery ticket hypothesis guys found that the transfer for WNLI works much better than for any other task, and that's because it just doesn't work at all. So, okay, any questions so far?
So I didn't get why it works and in what direction was transfer in the paper. They transferred from, they take some subnetwork and transfer it to WNLI?
Yeah, so this shows transfer between all tasks that they tried, right? So they mask on one task and then just evaluate on another task.
So source task is, for example, here like it's rows, and the columns are target tasks, transfer tasks. And so from any task you can switch to WNLI, and you in many cases you will be better. Why not the same score? Why you will be better but not worse, for example?
Well, I guess just any selection will give you slightly better chances. You see, the difference is never big, right? It's just 1-2% at best. But it's 1-2% with respect to like random baseline, because that's as good as BERT gets. So I guess just taking any subnetwork from any other task will already get you slightly better than random. But only slightly. But this is why it doesn't get better than random, because
and also I can't understand why you have these like the same values in all cells. You should have some noise in it, so still you will be able to remove something or not.
Well, that's what we got. The setup was exactly the same for all of them. So five initializations, and yeah, I agree. It looks weird, but that's what we got.
Okay.
So, okay, again, the rationale for doing all of this was to see whether the good subnetworks are stable across initializations and random initializations and tasks, because that would be consistent with all the findings from all the BERTology literature about how self-intention heads are meaningful and interpretable. We do not find to be the case. So let's go to see whether the lottery ticket hypothesis hold. And here we actually try 3 setups. Usually in lottery ticket hypothesis, you just are interested in how the good subnetworks are doing. But we also look at the bad subnetworks, which are the ones that we chose to be the worst possible ones for this task. And the random ones, which are supposed to be the same size as the good ones, but randomly sampled. Note that since we use glue, the test set is not publicly available, so we choose the masks based on the development set, and we also test on the development set. So whatever we're doing, we have no idea how it will generalize, and that's not our point, but we know that our masks are the best possible or the worst possible for this particular data that we are evaluating on, right? Because it was also used to find the mask. So the bad ones should be really, really bad, the worst possible ones. Okay, so let's look at magnitude pruning first. There's quite a lot of bars here. The first bar in each subplot is the majority class. The dark blue one is the full model performance. And then we show the good, the bad, and the random, both just pruned and retrained. And what we would expect if lottery ticket hypothesis holds is that the good subnetworks would match the full model performance after retraining. So you see that this is the case for most tasks except WNLI, which we already discussed. And this is also consistent with what the lottery ticket hypothesis guys found themselves and published in August this year. However, if you look at the bad and the random subnetworks, you see that they can still be retrained and they improve after retraining, but they don't improve nearly as well, right? And we see a clear trend that the good subnetworks are the best to be retrained and random are worse, and then the bad ones are even worse, right? So this all makes sense, and yeah, consistent with what we would expect. However, if we look at the structured pruning, the trend is not like that at all. So at first of all, you will see that the good subnetworks, the dark green ones, they don't match the full model performance anymore, but they're not like too far behind, right? So they don't fully match the full model, but they don't, well, the difference is not very big. But even more importantly, we don't see this difference between good, bad, and random anymore. The good and random mostly perform just as well after retraining, and the bad ones are still highly trainable. We show here the wireless TM plus glove baseline. In many cases, even the worst possible mask that you can take out of BERT, it will still do at least as well as that. So this is unexpected, and clearly this pruning method doesn't work the same way as magnitude pruning. To be quite sure, we looked specifically at the bad subnetworks, and on average, the worst possible subnetwork with structured pruning is only 1 point behind BIOS-TM plus ELMO on average. And with magnitude pruning, it's really, really bad, the worse than even SIBO baseline. And almost as bad if you randomly initialize the whole BERT and also randomly prune it. That's as bad as you would get from bad magnitude prune subnetworks. So yeah, this is why we say that when BERT plays the lottery, all tickets are winning. I guess more accurately, it would be to say when BERT plays the lottery, no tickets are losing. You don't quite win, but however you prune it with structured pruning, you can't do like completely horribly. And this, I guess, is good news for all the studies on compression and trying to make BERT smaller and more efficient, because this means that you just can't lose whatever you do. But it's bad news as far as trying to understand how it works, because it also means that it doesn't matter what you do, you will still get a pretty good performance.
But not for M pruning.
But not for M pruning, correct. For magnitude pruning, everything is everything makes sense. Okay, so final experiment, how linguistic are these good subnetworks? Again, we did the whole thing just because we wanted to know whether it is the case that BERT works so well because its heads have some linguistic capacities. And you may remember this paper from last year, MNLP, analyzing multi-head self-attention, specialized heads do the heavy lifting, the rest can be pruned. So this was not for BERT, this was for transformer, but Lena Vojta showed that you can prune different heads in the transformer, and the ones that they identified as syntactic or positional will be the last ones to go. So if they're correct, then this would mean that for BERT, we would also expect the highly important heads to be more meaningful, right? So for this experiment, we look not just at the good network, but at the super subnetwork. The super survivors are the heads and MLPs that survive in all tasks in all random initializations for a given task. And these subnetworks are much smaller than the ones I had shown before. This is like 13 to 25% of the full model. Oh, yeah, by the way, this is why WNLI showed that all numbers were the same. It's because basically all the heads got pruned. You see the pruned model size is like 1%. So if you prune it all the way up to the 90% of the full model, you can prune all of it and still get exactly the same. So it just all gets pruned. Okay, so self-attention pattern types. These are the types that were identified last year in the Revealing Direct Circuits of BERT paper. And we basically have these 5 types. The vertical attention means that the BERT just looks at the special tokens or punctuation. The diagonal one means that it just looks at the previous and next word. Vertical plus diagonal is just the combination of these two. Block attention means that it looks uniformly at the whole sequence. And then the heterogeneous pattern is the only one in which it is possible at all that it does anything interpretable, right? It is not necessarily the case that it does anything interpretable, but it's the only one in which it is possible at all. So this is like a crude upper bound on the amount of interpretable patterns. We considered 2 settings in this experiment, just the raw attention maps and the weight normed attention, which was also EMNLP paper this year. And this settings is supposed to reduce the amount of attention to the vertical, to the special tokens, and make the heterogeneous pattern more prominent. So we do the same thing as Kovaleva and colleagues last year. We just train a CNN classifier on annotated samples of attention maps. Those authors had 400 patterns, and then we had annotated 600 more for the weight normed attention. We take each glue task, we generate the maps from each head for 100 random examples, and then we use that classifier to classify all the maps. And again, we are interested in the amount of the heterogeneous patterns because that can be used as a crude upper bound estimate on the number of meaningful heads. So on the right, you see all the heads in BERT, and on the left, you see the super survivor heads. And you see that we do not get a stark difference in the distribution as far as heterogeneous heads go. We see actually more block attention, but the number of the ratio of the heterogeneous pattern, the blue part of the graph, that stays mostly the same. So it is not the case that super survivor heads are more meaningful on average. And we also don't get that when we looked at the weight normed attention pattern. What we mostly see is, mostly the same pattern, except that we get more vertical attention for MRPC, QQP, and QNLI. So that does not seem to be the case, that BERT's superior performance and the good subnetworks can be explained by the better encoding of linguistic patterns, or more interpretable encoding of linguistic patterns. So to sum everything up, we do have the good subnetworks, and in M pruning, they can be retrained alone to reach the performance comparable with the full model. In S pruning, they almost get there, not quite, but they almost get there. The good subnetworks are much more stable in magnitude pruning than in structured pruning. In magnitude pruning, you have this pattern that the good subnetworks can be retrained the best, the bad are the worst, and the random is between them. But in structured pruning, pretty much whatever you do, it doesn't matter very much. Even the bad subnetworks remain highly trainable. The success of the good subnetworks is not fully attributable to linguistically meaningful self-attention patterns, and that's very depressing given how much time and energy has been spent on trying to identify those meaningful self-attention heads. So that's what I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have one question to better understand your results. For the last conclusion, you have you are saying that is not fully attributable to linguistically meaningful self-attention patterns. How you know what attention patterns are linguistically meaningful or not? Because
well,
you are classifying them like diagonal, heterogeneous, and so on.
Yeah. So we don't know that the heterogeneous pattern is necessarily linguistically meaningful, but it's the upper bound, right? So if it is the case that the good subnetworks have more interpretable linguistic heads, they will have more of the heterogeneous pattern.
Why? Do you have some independent studies that saying that all the linguistic meaningful information in heterogeneous patterns?
Well, that's obvious, isn't it? So the vertical pattern is only looking at separator, classifier, and punctuation, right? So that's not meaningful.
Why not?
Well, it's not linguistically interpretable.
But diagonals, they are completely linguistically interpretable because
okay.
you can see that they are not straight diagonals. They have many noise around them. So it's like
that's true.
like a parsing and so on.
And
blocks also very linguistically interpretable because separators separate different sentences, and you need attention inside sentences.
Okay. So the block pattern looks at the more or less uniformly at the whole sequence, right?
No, no, block means that it looks more or less heterogeneously on the whole subsequence. Yes, because it separates. You have separator and all attention inside one part and another attention inside another part. So it means that it like the first part, which is the left top corner, like accumulates information and process information about first chunk of the sequence, which is before separator, and the second one, what is after the separator. It seems that it's meaningful, yes, because it wants independently consider these two subsequences.
Well, first, this is not okay. So this is an example where you have the separator token, right?
Yes.
If you don't have, if you encode only one sequence, it just means that all the words get about equal amount of attention.
Yeah,
right?
it will look like heterogeneous, I think.
Well, if it is, so what our classifier looked at is that there are a few words that clearly stand out, and they would be the ones for. Okay, let me find the original. Okay, so look at something like this, right? This is what people would normally consider a meaningful pattern. You would have to have a few words that are clearly linked between each other more than with any other words, right?
Yes, but here you can find that, for example, on both of these examples, you have large attention to separator or CLS.
Right. So attention to separator or CLS presumably means attention to the to some sentence representation as a whole, rather than attention between any word patterns, right?
Maybe.
So can we agree that that one is at least not directly encoding syntactic dependencies or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So as far as block attention goes, yeah, clearly, if there's a separator, then it is clearly aware of the separator. I guess it depends on how prominent is, if it has any words that are related to each other within the block, and that are, if they are more prominent, then yes, it will be a heterogeneous pattern, and hopefully our classifier would recognize it as such. But the chief takeaway from me is that BERT is aware that there are two sentences in this representation, right?
Mm-hmm. But for me, my question is, it would be cool to have results when you have these patterns, mm-hmm. and you like delete these patterns and then probe with some linguistic probes how quality degrades for these like sparsified and pruned architectures.
Okay, yeah, that is a different way to test that, and I agree this could be done. The amnesiac probing comes to mind. The MDL probing, yeah, so definitely many other things could be done. But what we do see is that we don't seem to have a stark difference. At least, well, especially if you look at the weight norm detention, which is supposed to get rid of all the classifier. Mm-hmm. We don't see that.
But can you go to these results because I think that they are important, and maybe explain a bit or discuss a bit these results. For example, why blocks are absent. It's because they are not after normalization. We have none of them because they are not contributing to actually calculating activations for the MLP, yes?
Well, I'd guess that, as you mentioned earlier, in case of a block attention with a separator, if you remove the separator with weight norming, then what it will look like is mostly going to be classified like a heterogeneous pattern. So in this case, the blue diagonal, the blue part of the bar probably encompasses them for both super survivor and all heads. My point is that the ratio doesn't seem to change much. What we do have is actually a lot more attention to separator in QQP, MRPC, and QNLI, and I can see why that would be the case because, well, this is paraphrase detection, right? And for these tasks, presumably, you do need a good sentence representation, so that could explain why you get more vertical pattern. But then I don't understand why you don't have the same for MNLI, because that should also need that. So again, this is not conclusive, of course, and many other probes could be done. But we opted to do this rather than some probes in which you learn extra amount of parameters, because whenever you learn more parameters, you are correspondingly less sure that your results are about the BERT representation and not about the parameters in your probe, right?
Yeah. By the way, do you know maybe some good way or some repo on GitHub where you can perform like probing for different tasks? So you have your BERT model, you run script, and you get results of probing for different tasks for different layers, and then you say train it, and then put again to this script and get out results for modified models. how different layers change their.
No, I don't know of anything like that.
Because that would be nice to have something like this.
It would, but again, so we opted to do this rather than the probes, because probes also have limitations, right?
Yeah.
So we first need to find which probe we actually trust. I agree that this one is not perfect, but yeah, I haven't tried every other one to see whether to see the one that I would trust more.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, any other questions from the audience? So, anyone wants to ask a question?
All yours. Do you guys think this is more good news or bad news? So bad news as far as interpretability goes, but good news as far as compressing goes.
I didn't understand yet. It needs sometimes to understand results better, because at some point of presentation, I lost track with the difference between S pruning and M pruning, and it seems like that at the end of the presentation, you are presenting almost for S pruning, but not for M.
Yeah. So this we only did for structured pruning because, well, obviously for magnitude pruning, you don't even have, you don't consider the heads. So it didn't make sense to do it for that.
You mean that if we prune weights or individual parameters, and we are not pruning heads, then we cannot analyze head types. But maybe after pruning some heads, changing their type. For example, if you have heterogeneous, it will be totally pruned out, so you know that it's not meaningful. For example, I don't know, or maybe some other head type is pruned.
Well, this is why I showed this from the beginning, and we already started arguing about that. So the magnitude pruned subnetworks are very stable across tasks and initializations, right? And the amount of weights that get pruned, you see, it's like 42. This 42 is the smallest, or 40, and the top one is maybe 59% of weights that survive. But it's not the case that some heads just completely get pruned. And most of them are around 52, 53. So it doesn't seem to be that the distribution of weights is very different in different heads per se.
But on the other hand, it's strange that you have a lot of structural pruning at the last layers on the right hand side, and but on the other hand, you have a lot of survived weights on the left hand side in the final layers.
Yeah, but for I wouldn't trust this one very much for the structured pruning, because it's just let's find another example. Yeah, see here it mostly survives in SST. Yeah, it's just very different.
And also, in some sense, this left hand side picture with the M pruning, it's in some sense contradicts a bit, not directly, to the results you have shown from the previous work, when it says that like middle layers are the most important.
Yeah. So but you need to keep in mind that the general setup was completely different. So in this work, as far as I remember, they took different layers independently and probed them, right? And here, when we exclude something, we still have the rest of the model to fall back on. I guess as long as one of if it is the case that the middle layers all encode about the same information, then by dropping any of them out, we can't do it as long as we still have this information in some other layer. And so we wouldn't have a higher concentration of middle layers in general.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that points, yeah. To me, a big question from all of this is, okay, BERT is large. We have 144. Sorry, that's my Google objecting. So we have a lot of heads. We have 144 heads. We have 12 layers, and it looks like it's a big model. But if you assume that different parts of this model encode some specific parts of linguistic knowledge, it's not much at all, right? If you say you have, I don't know, 5 heads that all do subject-object dependency, or I don't know, 3 heads that all do subject-verb agreement, you will run out of heads to store different dependencies in this way very quickly, right? So if it is the case that different layers were doing in principle different things, but it is also the case that you can drop almost all of them out, that just means that they were all doing the same information. And that means that it just doesn't know that much to begin with. If it can't be that compressed, and the amount of knowledge doesn't seem to diminish, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's big, but maybe it doesn't do quite as much as we were hoping.
Another question was about, have you thought about trying different bodies? So if you have 2 different BERTs, like the same BERTs but trained with a different initialization, so you can just take different from different repos with different parameters. They also should provide like different lottery tickets inside them.
Yep.
By pre-training. So have you compared, or do you think it's meaningful to compare these different BERTs?
I'd expect that we would find as much variance as here, maybe if not more. It doesn't seem to be the case that different BERTs would. Okay. It is possible that one BERT will be significantly better than another if these guys are correct, right? So these guys were doing these studies about fine-tuning BERT, and they were saying that some fine-tuned BERTs are a lot better than other fine-tuned BERTs. But maybe there is something like that for BERT itself, right? Maybe there is some ultra lucky initialization for BERT itself, which would make it a lot more better than any other BERT. I do not have the compute to do that experiment.
Okay.